Over to you, Ripa.
Good afternoon. Welcome to today's session on future-proofing inclusion and workplace culture. I am Ripa Rashid, and I'm delighted to spend the next 20 minutes with you to really talking about this topic that can be transformative for your workplaces in terms of driving engagement, creating value, and realizing the promise of diversity. I'll start off with some introductions and an agenda for today. We are going to be first setting the stage. Why are inclusive cultures and workplaces still important and more important than ever before today for your companies? Second, based on research, experience, and work I've done over the last 20 years, I'm going to be sharing a two-part roadmap of inclusion. One, around how you as an individual can advance inclusion in your workplace. And secondly, how you can shape and influence organizational inclusion. So that's the plan for today. Let's get started. First, an introduction to why I'm the one speaking to you about workplace inclusion. As I mentioned, my name is Ripa Rashid. I'm a managing director at Seramount, which is a talent and inclusion consulting firm based in the US, but we work globally. We work with 600 plus global companies. I have been in the diversity and inclusion space for 20 years, and these icons you see on this slide are some examples of my publications. I've had the privilege to write 3 books, including one around which is about professional women and careers in India, Brazil, Russia, and China. A lot of my work is global. I also am on the faculty of management at NYU Stern Business School, where I teach inclusive leadership. The work that I do in inclusion really is informed by 3 areas. One, my background in business. I have been a senior executive, a chief diversity officer at Fortune 50 companies. I have also been a management consultant. It's also informed by my degree in anthropology, where I study what gives human beings meaning. What inspires us, what motivates us, and what are the rituals and rites of inclusion and exclusion that make us feel like we belong, that make us feel like we want to be part of an organization and succeed. I am originally of South Asian heritage. My parents are from what was East Pakistan and is now Bangladesh, but I'm a third culture kid and grew up and lived all over the world. And I'm now based in the United States, but continue to work globally. So thank you very much to Avtar for having me as part of this conference. I'm delighted to be part of the conversation today. So let's start with some level setting. What do we mean by inclusion? Many of you know that, but for those of you who don't, let's kind of start with some definitions. We know that diversity and inclusion are diversity, though, means all the political leanings are. And until I told you, you did not know about my academic background. You can't, by looking at me, know that I'm a mother of 2 sons. You don't know that I'm married to someone who is from the Netherlands. So all of those things are underlying differences, and these differences are often our superpowers. Diversity is a reality of the everyday workforce. Inclusion is what brings it all together. It's the action of actually bringing all the best elements of diversity and making it into a better whole by identifying diversity as a superpower. And there is, over the last 20 years, a robust body of research, 39 plus documented measures of how, when you tap into the power of diversity through inclusion, you enhance business outcomes. The simplest way to think about the difference between diversity and inclusion is a quote by one of my favorite leaders in this space. You may have heard about her. Her name is Vernee Myers. She used to be the Chief Culture and Inclusion Officer at Netflix. Vernee Myers, she's a lawyer by training, and she always described this as Diversity is being asked to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. In other words, diversity is entering the door. Inclusion is actually getting a seat at the table and being asked to contribute. Without inclusion, you do not get the gains that come from diversity. So let's look at some numbers around this because I've been studying this for 20 years, as I said. And as a ex-management consultant, as a business person, we know that what gets measured gets done. And inclusion really needs to be measured. What we do know is that just like there is a business case for diversity, there's a very solid business case for inclusion. And here you see some of the elements of it. Firstly, we know that there are gains in terms of employee engagement. We know that employees with inclusive managers are more likely to feel that they can contribute and be innovative, and they're more likely to bring their whole selves to work in an inclusive environment. Organizations with inclusive cultures are also 6 times more likely to be innovative. And that if innovation is the 21st century key to growth and success for our companies, this is something no organization can afford to miss out on. But you get innovation when employees and teams put in discretionary work and they collaborate better. And all of our numbers around inclusion showed uptick in those metrics. And finally, this is research I've conducted. We found that organizations which are more inclusive are 70% more likely to capture new markets and 45% more likely to see their companies improve market share. In terms of cash flow and financial returns, similar gains. And inclusive companies are 1.7 times more likely to be innovation leaders in their market. So these are all good things. We've known some of this data for a long time. What gets in the way? We're going to talk about that, and we're also going to talk about some very pragmatic, practical strategies that you can deploy to enhance and advance inclusion in your organizations. So what gets in the way? What is the real state? Well, firstly, we know that most employees in our world today expect organizations to be inclusive. In our research, we find in the United States that 78% of employees value inclusion as an element of workplace culture. This was a statistically significant study across industries that we conducted at Seramount last year. We also find that 77% of Gen Z workers, and that's going to be the majority of your entry workforce, value diversity and inclusion in the workplace, and it influences their decision of where they want to work. They would rather work at a more diverse and inclusive workplace. And as your workforce become more diverse, we know that 50% of your entry-level pools at least are female. A certain percentage are LGBTQ plus, another percentage are neurodiverse, another percentage have disabilities. You're looking at a workplace that is over 50% represented by people from what we call traditionally diverse, underrepresented identities. So the reality is diversity is a fact, but inclusion is a choice. How do we know that? We know that inclusion is not everywhere because we know from Gallup surveys that are done year in, year out globally, only 21% of the global workforce reports being engaged. From our own research at Seramount, we find that globally, only 31% of our employees that respond to our work say that their senior leaders are inclusive. That's a big gap, 78% to 31%. We also know from Edelman's Trust Barometer that globally across 28 countries, including India, 63% of global respondents remain fearful in 2025 of discrimination, racism, and prejudice in society and in the workplace. So there are expectations, but failed realities, and inclusion can be the solution. So let's go into inclusion. Inclusion, in my experience and work, is a science. And what we've been doing is really trying to map what are the core levers that drive inclusion in your workplace and drive inclusive culture. And the 4 areas that are critical to shaping inclusion are the 4 you see on this slide. The first is around inclusion and authenticity. How included do your employees feel by their leaders, their direct managers, their peers? And how authentic do you feel like you can be in the workplace? Can you bring important elements of yourself to the workplace, like being a parent or a caregiver, like your religious identity, if that's important to you, like your sexual orientation, or do you have to mask and cover? The second piece is around psychological safety and team dynamics and what I call creating a speak up culture. Do you have teams where people feel that you can take a risk, you can admit mistakes, and still allowed to have a voice and contribute in an environment where you can trust and are trusted? That's a critical driver of inclusion. The third piece of this is networks and relationships. This is the organizational level of inclusion. How rich are your mentorship relationships, your allyship relationships? How many followers do you have as an individual? And who do you have sponsoring you and advocating for you? That's a huge part of whether you are included or not. If you have weak networks, inclusion is low. And finally, what is the value proposition of work for you? What is the career outlook? Are there paths that are non-linear if you need to take a break? Is there work life? Hybridity, hybrid work is a big element of the value proposition of work. So do you have a value proposition at work that makes you want to work there in the medium to long term and give it your 110%? So these are all the four categories, and you can measure each of these. I'm going to go into two sets of tools that really can drive this for you listening in today to drive inclusion and advance inclusion. One is for you, no matter who you are. You could be in the C-suite or you can be an individual contributor. You have a responsibility to drive interpersonal inclusion. I hope to give you some tools. You also have an ability to shape organizational systems and processes and culture. And I'll give you some strategies around that as well. So let's dive in. Let's start with the interpersonal. First, why it still matters. There's gaps around inclusion we find in every organization. I'm sharing with you some illustrative figures we have tracked in companies that we work with. We work with companies and do large-scale surveys and quantitative and qualitative anonymous focus groups. And what we find are some fascinating findings around the gaps around inclusion. On the left-hand side, this is again illustrative from a company, blinded data. We find that when we survey leaders and ask them, are you inclusive? Are you getting feedback, giving feedback? Are you making the quieter voices heard? Are you sharing credit? There are dimensions of inclusion. 94% of leaders in our work say, yes, we are inclusive. But when we ask their employees the same question, are your leaders inclusive? Guess what? Fewer than 60% say so. So there's a over 30% gap there. Secondly, we also track how much do you need to change yourself when you come to work in terms of leadership paradigms. How much of a mask do you have to wear? How much do you have to cover yourself? And we find some big gaps for anyone who is in a diverse talent pool. This shows the gap between men and women. While 62% of women in this particular instance feel that they really need to change themselves, only a third of men say so, almost half as many. So that authenticity conundrum can be wearing and take away from how much you can contribute. And it can also make you feel disengaged and in some ways not included. And we find this further when we track data around experiences of daily bias and microaggressions. All of you know the term implicit bias or unconscious bias, and we track the incidence of bias, and we find that 64% of women in the corporate workplace are experiencing bias in the last year. And the types of bias they experience are things like this that you see in this slide. People think that, I'm not able to take on certain opportunities because I have children. I'm not included in after hours conversations or informal conversations. I'm really not given the opportunity to present to the most valuable clients. People think that I was hired on account of my religious background. I was part of a quota hire. Supervisors are surprised when I do simple tasks well. Trust me, as a woman of color working as a minority in the United States, this happens to me not only in the last 6 months or a year, it happens to me every day. And the impact of this is corrosive. We can track it results in increased stress, depression, impaired performance. And while each one of these microaggressions might seem like a small thing, the most powerful articulation of the impact of this comes from a senior scientist at the Salk Institute, who, after many years of working and being successful, realized that she and her female peers were given smaller labs and had been given fewer scientists to work on their teams, and they decided to launch a class action lawsuit. And when talking about the biases, the scientists said each microbias felt like a feather, but a ton of feathers still weighs a ton. So there's a cumulative impact of microaggressions that can be large. So what do we do to counter this? Luckily, there are strategies that we've been studying. I'm going to share with you 3 core strategies that can make a real difference and cool and mitigate bias. The first is something everyone can do on a daily basis. These are micro interventions and micro affirmations. Very similar micro interventions are when you observe or experience a microaggression. For instance, when someone says, well, you've just come back from maternity leave, not sure you're ready for that particular high stakes assignment, you can say, well, not sure I agree with what you just said, and actually back it up with why. Or another way, and this might be a very American way, and there might be a culturally more fluid way to say this. Ouch, did you really mean that because I came back from maternity leave, my competencies are different? Sometimes you don't have to stand up yourself. Have an ally in the room. Someone can speak up for you. Micro affirmations can be very powerful. We all know the phenomenon of women or other underrepresented groups being talked over and somebody else saying something and being heard. So you can use a micro affirmation, say, actually, what Smita said was the same idea you've just said, but she said it 10 minutes ago. Another active thing, and this is something you can immediately place, we often find in the research that women and other underrepresented groups are often likely to be given the office housekeeping, meaning taking the notes, organizing the party, organizing the administrative tasks on top of their day jobs, no matter how senior they are. I've seen this happen at the C-suite level where I've operated. The women are all, again, asked to take the note. Rotating and creating structures in this can go a long way. And timely and effective feedback is a great way to enact a micro affirmation, because if you give someone feedback of that was great and you would have been even more powerful if you did X, Y, and Z, is a gift when you give it to someone, because often feedback doesn't travel well across lines of difference. Men might be afraid to give women feedback, and we find that when you actually actively give feedback to people you are invested in, that makes a big difference. The second big strategy around interpersonal inclusion is allyship. There's great research around allyship, which shows that companies with allyship initiatives, many of you might have those, have 21% higher engagement levels. And diverse employees are, far more likely to report a less biased workplace if they have an ally. So allyship is really supporting and advocating for groups that are different from your own. It's not about power structures. It's not about majority minority. It is really about allying across different identities. And while allyship might seem like a simple concept, the way it's applied can be subtle. The model that you see on the right-hand side is a version of what Salesforce has very successfully used. And it actually requires you to think of, when I want to be an ally, do not declare yourself, I am an ally. Actually earn the allyship. Ask, how may I be an ally? And in your allyship practice, there are many things you can do. You can listen and learn about different experiences of the group that you are allying with or the individual you are allying with. You can ask questions about the experience to learn more. You can read about this, but you also can be present. If there's a gathering, if there is activism, you can be, and if people are not in the room from that identity, you can speak up for them. So this is something men can do for women, women can do for other groups, and LGBTQ individuals can do for women. So allyship is an incredibly powerful mechanism that I encourage you all to use. The last piece about this is inclusive leadership, and this is something I've been teaching for many, many years to executives as well as to graduate students around the world. And we have codified a set of behaviors that really create a speak up culture and advance psychological safety in measurable ways so you get better business outcomes you started off with. And what you see here are the 6 core behaviors that an inclusive leader can enact. 1, making sure everyone gets a voice. 2, giving actionable feedback. We just talked about it. 3, making it safe to propose new ideas, to propose an idea that might be completely out of the box. Taking advice and implementing feedback, saying, how am I doing as a leader? Empowering your team to make decisions, not micromanaging, in other words, and then sharing credit for team success, really talking in terms of we as well as I. So these behaviors have been shown to create psychological safety, to create speak up cultures that drive innovation. So those are the 3 things you can do: allyship, microaffirmations, and inculcate inclusive leadership behaviors. But remember, this is not just about training. You can train people on all of these things, but it's also about role modeling those behaviors. It's about celebrating those behaviors, and it's also about measuring and creating positive ways to scale those behaviors in your organization through competency models, performance management, etc. So in the last few minutes, I'm going to go to the organizational sets. We all know that bias is a reality of human existence. Biases work both ways. There's in-group bias, and then there's out-group bias. In-group bias is a preference for those like us. Out-group bias is the opposite of a preference. And this is an example of some videos from a campaign that Catalyst Women, which is one of the world's preeminent organization around gender equity, did a couple of years ago, about how the same behaviors can be characterized differently depending on identity. For a man is a boss, a woman is bossy. A man is thoughtful, a woman is quiet. There are legions of examples like this. There's a lot of underestimation that goes on for the same behaviors, depending on whether you represent the majority of leadership or are a new, diverse talent pool. And these types of cultural and social biases get encoded into the talent systems. Here you see, starting from interviewing and hiring, the cycle of the talent management system most organizations operate on, from interview and hiring to attracting and recruiting talent, to engaging communications, to managing performance and career advancement, to talent review and succession planning. Each one of these elements often encodes stereotypes on who is the right candidate, who is a culture fit. I urge you to get away from the word culture fit and think of culture alignment, of value add. Who is a leader? All of those things enter in here. And I'm going to leave you with 2 key strategies and practices to counter bias and advance inclusion in talent management systems. Again, we're going to look at the full life cycle of talent, and for hiring and sourcing, some of you might already be doing this, but this is a comprehensive list of the types of things we see leading companies doing around the world. A, insisting on a diverse slate of clients, at least for your more senior roles. Some organizations commit to hiring, having at least a third of their slates as diverse, whether by gender, LGBTQ, caste, religion, some or any other identity of difference for interviews. It's not a quota, it's just that you have to commit to an interview slate that is diverse. There's no guarantee for a job, but that's proven to show a higher propensity of conversion to diverse hires. Make sure also that your interview process is inclusive. What are the questions you're asking and who is being interviewed? I remember early in my career in management consulting, it was all male interviews in a very predominantly male environment. And I actually went to work for the one company where women were sent to interview me. Um, Second piece is around development. This is around mentoring, making sure everyone has access. That's kind of something you're all probably already doing. Establishing pathways for sponsorship for talent. Really, how do you give visibility to your diverse talent pools? Make sure they're getting those high value projects, work assignment, less housekeeping, more high value work for your diverse talent. And then finally, for advancement, making sure that you have sponsorship and advocacy because majority talent naturally gets this. We find big gaps for talent who are non-traditional. So really creating mechanisms, whether they be formal programs or less formal education, really important. Make sure that you create bias interruption and promotion discussion when a woman might be described as quiet and a man might be described as thoughtful. Make sure you have the data and someone in power to question that dual usage of words. And then when you have promotion slates, make sure that those are inclusive. Does the promotion slate represent the talent pool behind it, or is it just of one kind? So these are some very tangible, practical things you can do. And down here are some examples that you can use. And the final piece of this is back to my favorite topic around metrics. Most organizations that have successfully moved the needle on inclusion, I've worked with dozens of companies, have dashboards, which they use for diversity and inclusion. They're measuring the traditional diversity metrics around representation, hiring, promotion, attrition, but they're also measuring things like what percentage of your talent are, how diverse are the pools that are going to leadership programs? What does your succession pool look like? And who sees this data and what kind of decision making is made based on the data can be critical too. And I urge you to work with your HR and DI leaders and your HRIS system to create dashboards that are simple because less is more and actionable. And to do this kind of data analysis and tracking on a regular basis. I myself have created dashboards for dozens of companies, and at the very senior level, very simple dashboards that are reported to the board. And finally, I'm going to leave you with measuring inclusion. This is still new. We know that there are some agreed on measures around diversity, but when it comes to inclusions, there is less consensus, but there's an emerging consensus, and that's what I've tried to share with you. What share of your employees view their leaders, direct managers, and peers as inclusive? How much do they feel that they have the ability to speak up and contribute? How much do they feel like they have to alter themselves to operate in the workplace? How strong are their internal networks, laterally, vertically? And how much longer do they want to work there? Do they feel they can realize their ambitions in your workplace? And when you measure this, and if you find gaps between men and women, if you find gaps between LGBTQ plus and non-LGBTQ, if you find gaps between groups, those are the gaps that you need to close to advance inclusion. And in the companies I've worked for, we've done this year on year and created targeted solutions that can really change the story. So there you have it, a 5-step approach for future-proofing your organizations and building in inclusion into your workplace culture at an interpersonal level and an organizational level. Micro-affirmations and interventions, allyship, and inclusive leadership at the individual level, encoding inclusion into talent systems in the ways I described, and then measuring, tracking, and creating accountability. I'm going to leave you with 2 quick thoughts. A recap, Why this is important. The business case is always important. Communicate it. Inclusion drives engagement, innovation, bottom line results. Just diversity is not going to do it. You need inclusion too. And finally, each of us, in keeping with the theme of this year's conference, the power of I, has an opportunity to contribute to inclusion. This is a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, the great civil rights activist, who said, "The ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but the silence over that by the good people." So inclusion is a fundamental way for us to break the silence. And today I hope I've given you some valuable and actionable tools for you to ally, come along with me, and create the workplaces where bias is diminished, where psychological safety and trust flourish, innovation is spurred, and we create better outcomes, win-win for employees, for our organizations, and for society as a whole. Thank you.